You are listening to the North American Kings podcast, your traditional masculinity training ground. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski, founder of North American Kings LLC, a leadership development company based in Cincinnati, Ohio. As we all know, the man brand has taken an absolute beating over the past few decades, and it's our mission to change that. We're going to do that by helping you join the fight to reclaim traditional masculine values. Welcome to headquarters. Training starts now. Welcome back to the training ground, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. We've got a very exciting show for you today, including an interview with a conflict resolution coach who's here to help us with some very practical advice on de-escalation. Having said that, let's get started. This show today is brought to you by our friends at Naked Armor Razors and Wet Shave Gear. Are you guys tired of shilling out money every month for plastic cartridges with blades that wear out after just a few uses? Convenience is a good thing, but it seems like sooner or later they're going to be asking for a subscription for everything, like underwear and toilet paper. That's just one of the many reasons why I enjoy owning a straight razor from Naked Armor. No worries about whether I'll outrun my subscription or whether a snowstorm will delay shipping and I'm low on blades. You buy one blade, that's it. Made with care and of the highest quality steel, these blades are intended to last you a very long while. I'm planning on handing mine down to my oldest son when he starts shaving himself. And because you're not throwing these away casually, you'll end up doing your part for the environment and ultimately saving yourself around $1,000 over a 4-year period. More if you shave your head like I do. Now, right now, my listeners get a 15% discount on anything in their online store by going to nakedarmorrazors.com and entering code KINGS15. Don't wait to start enjoying the highest quality shave you'll ever give yourself. nakedarmorrazors.com. So, I mentioned in our intro that we're going to be discussing de-escalation today. Well, in regards to what? Now, today, I want to take our first steps into the cardinal responsibility of teach. And we're going to be touching on the cardinal responsibility of discipline as well, because these two are very intermixed. Now, I keep saying cardinal responsibilities, and it seems like I'm going back to the four things in every episode. Well, the reason I'm doing that as a reminder, guys, is I want to distill this down to their basic functions. So we distill down the cardinal responsibilities into these primary four things. And I'm doing that so that you guys can work your way up to whatever situation you're really dealing with at home. So I mentioned provide, protect, teach, and discipline. And everything's kind of built off of those four things. So if you guys can apply this to other stuff that you're dealing with, then that's the real point. So I don't want it to seem like we're rehashing the same things all the time. And if you feel that way, again, let me know at podcast@NorthAmericanKings.com. But when I articulate the cardinal responsibilities, the order that I do so, it was taken into consideration. We say provide, protect, teach, and discipline. As I've mentioned before, I'm not the person who came up with these. I don't know who did, but the sources are ancient and they're varied, and I've seen them. It's not just one discipline, which is the beauty of this. It's a lot of them. There's many. Now, provide is the first cardinal responsibility because it sets us apart as men. Provide is unique to us, where protect is something that we're designed to do better, but women are still very capable of defending themselves. There are plenty of weaknesses that women can exploit when it comes to defending themselves from dudes, right? And those weaknesses are natural. Similarly, men's ability to provide in an almost primal way sets us apart because it is natural. It's designed that way. So some of the reasoning here, it's mirrored in the United States Constitution. Why? Because it's primal, it's fundamental. And the First Amendment is what makes us primarily unique in the world as a country, right? Same way with provide. That makes us as men unique. The second thing, protect, or Second Amendment, ensures the right of the first, right? And a macro and on a micro scale. So teach is the third of the four cardinal responsibilities because it's ingrained in men to be teachers if we are succeeding in our performance of the first two. Think about the best teachers you've ever had. That football coach, that father, someone, whoever it was, whoever that man was that you looked up to, ask yourself, was he capable of providing for those around him? Now, I understand this is not a digital question. There are shades of yes and no here, right? In general, could this person do it? I'm willing to bet the farm that the answer is yes. And secondly, in both order and weight, we have the cardinal responsibility of protect. Now, let me ask it this another way. Was that person, this teacher, was that person able to make you feel secure? Not safe, secure, like not in a physical protection type of way, but was this person capable of making you feel secure in your environment so that learning could actually take place? Safe from harsh words, safe from judgment, free to learn as you learn best, as you individually learn best. It reminds me of the movie Just Like Dad from back in 1995. The story is about a kid, Charlie, who was bullied in school. He wants to impress this girl, like the usual 90s shtick, right? There's this father-son picnic that comes up, and wanting to use this as his way to break the unfortunate mold that he was cast in, Charlie decides to replace his father on the team. He trades his father, a weak and mistreated scientist, for a weightlifter that he meets at a local gym. Like, he goes out and recruits this guy. Now, originally, Charlie wants to pay this guy his allowance or like some money that he had saved up. But instead, the weightlifter, Joe, has Charlie come and work for him in his office. Now, I'll save you the rest of the story. It's a decent movie. It's played pretty well. But it's hard to take a person seriously who's not performed the cardinal responsibilities well. You know, women have their own set of responsibilities. Women are more nurturing. Women are more approachable, right? There are a lot of things that make women great teachers, and they want to teach, right? But men are designed to actually get that across, to be taken seriously, to be teachers regardless of whether or not the student wants to learn from us. And that's a powerful thing. If you cannot provide for yourself as men and yours in a material and emotional way, any advice that comes for you is going to fall on deaf ears. Now, I am not knocking people who go hungry in order to provide for food for their children or their spouse. If you are in one of those situations, please email me at podcast@NorthAmericanKings.com and I will get you help. Okay? That person, ladies and gentlemen, is making an active choice to provide for someone or provide for others when someone is going to go without. When that's an inevitability, they'd rather go without food themselves than have somebody else do that. That's not a failing to provide. That's a temporary situation. And there is help out there. And never will I say that help is not necessary in some cases, right? But that's not the same thing as living off of somebody else, right? So men who live off of somebody else are going to have to explain that, especially if they have kids or if they're trying to teach somebody else. Dad, why does mommy go to work while you stay at home? The answer is going to have to provide some value. If you tell the kid, or you tell your son or your daughter that it's just because you don't need to, and that you just want to stay home and play video games all day, well, you're going to have a hard time teaching that kid. Or worse, they're going to glean those traits and habits off of you, and you're going to have a dysfunctional child. So it's because you aren't providing value in that equation. That's what the dysfunction there is. If you aren't providing any value, your advice is going to carry as much weight as you provide. So if the value you bring is zero, well, guess what your word's worth? Now, the answer instead, I stay home because mommy makes enough for everyone, and one of us wanted to stay here and take care of you. That is a value-added response that doesn't take away from your ability to provide. Your capability is still intact. You're just providing in a different way. You're providing a different service. You know, you have to back that up with actual performance, just like mom, or just like I do in her, at my day job, right? That we provide value in different ways. I've said it before on this show, and I'll say it again. I applaud stay-at-home parents. I think it's very necessary in this day and age to have kids have a stable home life. Now, my wife is an extremely active stay-at-home mother. Her title, and I call her this, and she loves it, house manager, because she is. Because she's on it. She's providing a very real value, not just to my children. She's providing a value to me. Now, men, dads, if this is you, earn that title. Be the boss when you're at home, regardless of whether you're bringing in cash. Now, circling back to the movie, there's a scene where Joe has Charlie work off his debt rather than just take his money. So even in receiving a debt owed, he's teaching Charlie about professional business functions, right? He's able to provide Charlie with work, the service of actually pretending to be his dad and succeeding at that, all of which makes Charlie that much more capable of learning from him in the process of repaying that debt. So Joe in this situation is providing, protecting, and teaching, right? And I'll get it, again, you guys can go watch the movie and see if there's anything else that you recognize, but this was a great example shown again in 1995 movie, 1995 movie. Now, protect, it's not as critical as provide for some obvious reasons, really. Like in the movie, the dad is obviously mistreated at work, right? He's still able to provide food and a house and all that other stuff, but he brings this mistreatment home, and his son can see it. He knows about it just very, very, very specifically. And the perception that he couldn't protect himself, bled into his son's perception of him. So much so that Charlie felt that his father's lack of a backbone would translate into these events, this father and son picnic events, which was Charlie's way of breaking his mold, right? It's his way of remaking himself. And because his father wasn't going to help him protect and provide in those situations, it forced him to make a decision to bench his father to replace him with another man. That's awful, right? And it feels awful, but this kid's doing what he had to. And as we just talked about, that man was clearly capable of providing and doing all these other things. He was hired, and he succeeded at protecting Charlie's dignity in a physical way. And what happened, he ended up requiring Charlie to learn from him as repayment. Now, as a function of teaching, boys take men who can protect seriously. Just like wolves, boys and adolescent men need structure from that an alpha would provide. Right now, again, I'm not trying to turn people here who are listening into alphas, but what I am saying is that alphas do have tendencies that are translated into leadership and translated into teaching. Some of those things we do need to do. So alphas are confident in their knowledge, which in this case is what you need. You don't need to be the CEO of a business to be taken seriously and to teach someone. You need to be secure in your knowledge. That's what protects you. Anyone who's done any amount of public speaking can tell you this. Your ability to speak in public is only ever enhanced by your familiarity with the source material. Now, if you're a teacher, you need to know that. You know your source material back and forth. And that knowledge is what protects you. And when you can protect yourself, your students can teach, when you're trying to teach, they can perceive that and they take solace in it. You can teach them something in this perspective. Now, an article from Ohio University by P.L. Crawford and H.L. Bradshaw titled "Perception of Characteristics of Effective University Teachers" outlines a point. What characteristics make a good teacher? Now, for the purposes of this study, they settled on 4. They settled on empathy. What is empathy? Quickly, empathy is whether or not you can connect your student or your customer's need for information. Or do you understand their situation? Do you feel for them? Can you kind of put yourself in their shoes? The next trait, organization. This shows your knowledge of the subject, but also it helps make information easy to absorb. If we talked, like even in this format, if I were jumbled and jumped from idea to idea to idea in the wrong order, you would still get the information. It would still hit you in a certain way, but it would not sink in and flow and be absorbed in the right way or efficiently. You might miss something, right? So as a good teacher, that's important. Personality is how you decide to convey the information. In one word, it's delivery. Not just, is this person really dry? Does this information make you want to fall asleep? No, or is this guy jovial and funny or whatever? But, depending on the student, your delivery matters a great deal. And then the fourth critical characteristic, verbal fluency. And this shows whether or not you're comfortable with the information that you're showing. The perception here is that if you are competent with the information and you can speak it effectively, the question gets answered. Does this guy believe what he's even talking about? The answer might be no or yes. And again, the perception there is in grades. They also made a point in the study, and it showed numerically, which is the funny part. They were able to numerically show that what works with students doesn't necessarily work with teachers or their colleagues. And what I took from that, because I'm not a teacher, like in a classroom, academic setting, teaching children or teaching adults or teaching friends or teaching other people, the approach you take needs to be tweaked for every situation. Again, know your audience, right? But there are tweaks in language and your approach that need to be taken. Adults are teachers, usually, or they see themselves that way. And because of that, we must approach them as a colleague of sorts, regardless of your actual relationship. With knowledge of the subject matter and a familiar nature to it, you can provide for the student. And intellectually, you are capable of providing security. Okay, so you have the provide piece, the knowledge. You've got the protect piece figured out because you intellectually can speak to the subject matter. And your knowledge surpasses theirs. And if they make a mistake, there's an amount of trust that they've placed in you in order to protect them from these fatal errors, these fatal flaws in their logic. And they expect you to tweak that. Now, teaching starts with you. I was discussing 5S with one of the original students of TPM as it was being brought to the United States. Now, this was at the very first Toyota plant here in the United States. It was down in Georgetown, Kentucky. One of the first people to actually walk through this system and do it is now a consultant. I've got a bit of a relationship with this gentleman, and he was doing some work here at my current facility. And during a portion of that work, he came up to my office, and admittedly, organized chaos is the way of most businesses, especially a smaller business, and we need to strive to be better. I admit that. We all have our challenges. Well, this man was speaking to me, and we were talking through some of this TPM system that I've created. And then he acknowledged my coordinator, who was sitting right next to me. And he mentioned to my guy that we needed to tidy up our office. We have both of our desks right there. And the consultant gentleman is from Toyota, where 5S as an organizational style is almost like a religious practice, right? It's a religious exercise. They do it consistently. Anybody could walk up to anybody's desk and find exactly what they needed. Now, for those of you who don't know, 5S is a business process where we sort, shine, set, standardize, and sustain our business areas and the processes that manage it. I say all that, basically, we clean everything. We give everything from this coffee cup to this pen to my mouse and my computer a home where things are meant to be, and then we maintain that level of order. The philosophy behind that is if we have our house set in order, the business function will change the way we are disciplined and go about our business. And it's proven to work, but it's a huge system that needs to be maintained vigorously. For men, sometimes this process is natural and sometimes it's not. That kind of went without saying. But this man said to my coordinator, the reason we implemented 5S at our facility to the level of having our desks taped off is because it starts with us. If we don't have the discipline in order to implement 5S in our own personal spaces, we could not expect to teach it out on the floor. And that makes sense. Now, this is where teaching and discipline meet. Executing change is difficult in any environment. There will be a natural, inevitable amount of resistance. To implement ideas to people who don't directly report to you, this also takes some extra commitment in order to ensure that everybody else, all the other decision makers, are actually on board. And if we can't hold the standard ourselves, how can we expect others to do the same? There's this old leadership adage that anybody in leadership has heard before, and if this is your first time, congratulations, right? You're going to learn something very critical. The best leaders out there would not ask their people to do something they wouldn't be willing to do themselves. And sometimes this is from a legal perspective, like as a supervisor in a manufacturing facility cannot tell you to do something that's illegal or unsafe, right? It's not legal to do that. But more importantly, from a people manager perspective, if you wouldn't follow or carry out that order yourself, then you should not be giving it. Moreover, if we can't uphold standards on our own, then we can safely assume that the organization or department doesn't have the internal willpower to see through the enforcement phase and make sure that the process holds. Some companies require, to their detriment, the or what question to be answered, especially for anything to land on the floor. That's not exactly healthy. It's something that needs to be worked over. One of my old bosses used to ask me, "Is this a hill you're willing to die on?" Now, he asked me that. He'd ask it of the greater management team. He asked it all the time. And he wasn't asking me or asking the business whether or not the plan was a good plan. He was asking us that were we willing to fight it out for the change to go through the hard times. There, again, is going to be a natural amount of resistance that is inevitable. It got us asking ourselves, are we committed to fighting it through the resistance, through the struggles, through the emotions? And sometimes the answer was no. But it was a very good grounding question. I always appreciated that out of that supervisor. Now, in business, you don't always have the luxury of foreknowledge, right? When you're being required to work with or manage people that have a knowledge set that you don't. A great coach will be able to manage these employees by having a cursory understanding of their process or being skilled at asking questions. Now, I'll explain this in just a moment. More often than not, employees are also going to be a little bit heated. They might be angry, agitated, or frustrated about either the situation or you. And when you're needed, this is going to give you an added element of suspense, terror, anxiety, whatever emotion you're going to feel. It's going to add an extra dimension that you're going to need to manage. Now, in particular, sometimes I go into fight mode, right? And I don't do it as in like, hey, I'm getting tense, I want to fight this person. I go into fight mode as like I'm thinking very strategically about the conversation piece. Now, there was a great famous leader in voice, and I'm not going to say his name because I don't know the legalities of it, to be honest with you. Like, I'm doing a podcast. I don't know if I'm allowed to quote this guy without his permission. But anyway, he's a famous voice in leadership currently. And he said something during an interview. And he said that there were moves in leadership that you can do that will guide the tense conversation in a way that you control. And that was a very profound thing for me to hear from this guy while I'm just a supervisor. And it was because I do think that way. You say something, it can be, hey, disarming. Hey, you say these other things, you ask these questions in a way that gets you a controlled response. And you can get through several conversations like that once you're into the thick of things. From back in my sales day, RAC is a great tool that you can use, and you can use it over and over during a conversation to ensure that things progress the way you want them to. RAC, spelled R-A-C. It's restate, answer, and check. Okay, now we'll go over this in detail. So, restate. Again, this does us a couple of things. Okay, I'm going to restate the situation and kind of repeat it back to the person I'm coaching. The reason some people do this from an emotional standpoint, You reflect. I'm doing this as a restate. This does a couple of things. It allows me control. Okay, more specifically, and when I say control, I'm defining the situation. More specifically, it allows you, through this control, it allows you to filter out some of the emotions for the employee, especially if you've got to do this quickly. Okay? So if you happen to get a detail wrong as you're spelling things out again, you're going to retelling the story they just told you, but if you get one of those details wrong, they'll clarify it for you and it give you a better understanding of the situation, right? So it's a check and balance. It allows you control of the narrative. You get to take out some of those emotions. If they're freaking out and they're talking through things, you can certainly use this skill or you can use this as a way to kind of stop things. This also invites dialogue. And now they're seeing you as an ally rather than the problem itself. Sometimes as a supervisor, you're just going to be the bad guy. It happens. So, hey boss, it's your problem. You're the one at fault. Well, no, I didn't really have anything to do with this, but okay. Like I know they're trying to vent this onto me or you or whoever. But the reason it's important to restate the problem, you can take some of that accusation out of it and explain the situation accurately as it physically functions. You're outlining effectively what you can control in the situation. You can make that decision, and you can make those subtle changes as long as they're subtle. And if it is something that you absolutely did, believe me, your customer is going to tell you. Okay? Now, my favorite words to use in a situation like this, once you've actually established a kind of a time frame for what happened, if there's something that you didn't define or something that didn't work, you get to say, "Show me." And believe me, they will take you out and show you the exact problem that happened, which will allow you to see the situation. You can also see the auxiliary stuff. You might have perspective that they don't, and this will help you. Restating also allows you to control pace. In most situations, you actually want to slow it down. This calms things down. You restate things in a slow, calm fashion where they're very heated. They're almost compelled to meet your pace, especially if you're calm and deliberate and you're speaking to them about something that they need. They need you in this situation. So controlling pace is very, very important. Restating in a form of a question is important. If you try this, sometimes I restate the situation point for point. I slow things down, but humans, remember, are wired to answer questions. Like it's a compulsion for us to do so. We do not like to just leave questions hanging. And if you restate and you ask a question at the end, I'm effectively asking their permission. Do you approve of this version of what happened? They're inclined to listen. Now, warning, depending on how the employee views you, this can either show that you're committed to helping them because you're going through the motions of trying to very thoroughly understand the situation. You're trying to understand their pain so that you can fix it. If they're not a fan of you right now, they may accuse you of not listening. Oh, why do you got to repeat everything I just said? But that's easily batted down after you've explained that you're trying to thoroughly understand the situation in good faith. And that's when you have to pull through. They'll have their focus on you like a laser. Is this person just messing with me? Of course not. And you wouldn't be, right? You wouldn't be a good leader if you didn't. So when you have to bat that down, you must follow through. But either way, it's a positive, because when you do follow through, even if the answer is, I can't do anything for you, the business has decided that we're not going to invest money in this problem or something like that, here's a way that we can get around it. Either way, that you're still on their side. Either way, it's positive. Now, the second piece of this is answer, right? And which is kind of, it's pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. You answer their question, you go through their process, you give them direction, either a fix or a way around it. And now you've got a forum, they're listening. And then that leads you to check. Again, you circle back. You make sure that your direction worked for the situation. On longer term solutions, you're going to need to vet your results anyway to get credit for it, right? If you're on a project. But in a short term teaching or discipline situation, you also want to make sure that the instructee is actually complying with what you said. And then if they are complying and there are struggles that they're going through, you get to start this process all over again. This gives you the opportunity to provide yet another bit of help in these situations, and then you're building a positive rapport with your student. The ability to communicate here is absolutely critical. Okay, when coaching small children, I've often found, like, let's call it their heightened emotional state. They're freaking out. It's in large part due to their inability to communicate their thoughts. Right? They don't know how to express their feelings. That's why a lot of conservatives right now are taking the stance that children shouldn't be heard literally. And it's because they can't articulate precisely what they're feeling, right? And we need to be able to do that for them. So I just went from employees to children, but being able to communicate, I'm building to a point, so just hold on there, guys. But we're building to something bigger. So that's why baby sign language is a thing. Have you guys ever seen or heard this? My oldest was in daycare and they taught him some things. It helped, but it also it limited us to what he was wanting to communicate, which most parents get. Like moms or new parents will tell you like their baby's got a certain cry. Hey, I know that cries because he's hungry. That cries because he's tired. That cries because he's hurting. That cries because he's got to change. We got to change him, right? They cry in a different way. It's almost like a little language, and we understand those things. We're able to figure that out. The problem is when we're trying to communicate to someone, and this is the critical piece, and they don't understand us. Now, I'll be honest. I'm going to lose some people with this next comment. Okay, but I think it needs to be said. I am a pro spanking advocate. Okay, I've been told previously that spanking is abuse, and I'll be honest with you. In some cases, abuse is a subjective term whose definition changes in common conversation, so that someone can make a point. Right? Hey, I spanked my kids. That's abuse. No, it's really not. And because I'm not beating my kids, I'm spanking my kids early precisely to teach them things that I can't convey in words. They do not understand me. It was a vehicle, and that's what I think. I think that it might be a line there. Now, because we use spanking as a vehicle, you need to pay attention to it, right? Like you wouldn't just drive a car or ride a motorcycle without paying attention to your surroundings or paying attention to the actual vehicle, right? Perfect moment here. My oldest child, little Glenn, responds immediately to spanking. Okay? He gets spanked a couple of times. Next time you even hint at it, he's not doing that thing anymore. Awesome. It worked. And especially when he couldn't understand what we were saying to him. And I'll take you through that process here in a minute. Now, my meathead second child, Clark, he does not respond to spanking. You could spank him all day and it would not process. It would just in one ear and out the other. He would not understand the purpose of that. And we recognize that early. And because, this wasn't the proper discipline, or this wasn't the proper vehicle from which we were disciplining early, we didn't use it, right? We used to teach consequences. We used it to teach consequences and boundaries. My meathead responded very well to baby jail or his crib. He hated it. Now it's go stand in the corner and put your nose in the corner. It works like magic. And he absolutely hates it. But both of them are extremely well disciplined. Especially when they're outside the house. In our house, they're still boys, and they're exploring their limits, and they're exploring their capabilities, and they do it often, and we encourage that. But when they're out in the real world in new places and they're vulnerable, they go right back to the fundamentals. They listen, they obey, they trust us. They still have fun too. Like, they're not broken. This is not going to break your kids if you do it the right way. So like the example in the first episode of the show, it's all about disciplining the behavior, what they did, not the child personally. Okay? And they are looking for that. So you need to make that clear. So even that process, it follows a specific pattern. Show them what not to do. Use words as you can to convey this message. You're trying to teach them your language. You wait for them to repeat it. right? The actual thing, like, hey, don't touch that outlet. Okay. Then when they start going for it again, spank. And I only do it until they got teary-eyed. And that to me was the physical line there. It was more emotion than pain at that point. But you show them again, don't do that. That you get spanked when you do that. Okay? And then you tell them what you're doing is why they got spanked. And then you follow that with a quick, I love you. And then if they need it, some separation. Hey, I don't want to be around daddy right now. Hey, mommy's over there. She's not gonna take his side, but she will be comforting. Right? Another situation that we dealt with it in a very similar way, biting. Okay, my oldest was a chomper. We found out that he was using his teeth as intended. He was using them as a way to protect himself. God, he is such a man. I'm kidding. He's still learning, but he has these tendencies. Now, every time a kid bites another kid in daycare, you get a full page write-up of the situation. And they always said things very nicely. Little Glenn bit a friend today, blah, blah, blah. And I swear we could have wallpapered at least one of his bedroom walls. It would have been a nice accent wall over here, just write-ups and citations, right? But to reiterate, this was all before he could express himself in words. We recognized this before he could talk. And we kind of saw that there was a pattern there. When he did this when he felt his rights or his thought process were being interrupted by another kid, right? And he's my son, so we wrestle, we're rough, so he's defending himself like he would with me. Very effective on another, 1-year-old. Now, he's never bit me at this point, so I couldn't teach him that. I didn't know I had to, so here we go. So we're in a teach situation rather than discipline, right? No, discipline happens primarily when teaching fails, right? So I had to teach him what he was doing. He didn't know what pain he was inflicting on these other kids. So we saw that. We knew it had to be stopped. So at this point, he hadn't felt too much pain before either. And I take some pride in that. So the situation happened a few days later where we are wrestling and he gets a little agitated and he goes in for the kill, right? He goes in for the bite. Finally. So I avoid the bite, told him no bite, because he understands those two words. And in my commander's voice, I lean in and I bit him. Right? It took out his forearm and just chomped right down on him. And again, like spanking, it was just enough pressure and time for him to cry out a little bit. He got a little nervous. Okay? And that was then it was the exact same process. He explained you don't bite. This is what you're doing to other kids. Do not bite daddy. Right? And at that point where I bit him, I'm pointing at it because he still didn't quite grasp what inflicting pain was. And guess what, folks? He never bit a kid again. Same thing happened with Clark, the meathead. It took a little while longer because he was more apt to hit someone. And we've been working through that. But again, nothing bad has happened. Now they do the Heisman right now when they're trying to get their space from kids. They'll just shove that arm out, which is fine. But the point is, they're now able to communicate. They're using their words when they can. Now, children, or at least little boys, or wolves, they respond well to structure. Men, when you have kids, or when you're teaching other people, be kings, right? That dude who's sure of himself, that guy who knows what he's supposed to be, what he's about. He holds himself, he's confident, and he's capable of teaching it. Kids and the people around them will take notice. Now, I mentioned that the ability to communicate is critical. If you cannot communicate, nothing can be taught. That's why de-escalation is critical. When people are emotional, they're not receptive to information. Same thing goes with a child, with an employee, anyone. The information will be heard, but the patterns are so jumbled in the slew of emotions that they never get processed. And I'm not meaning to equate my children with dogs, but it's the same exact situation. When your dog gets extremely excited, you need to break through the noise of the situation, of the other dog, of the raccoon, or whatever. You need to be able to break that through with sharp whistle or something that kind of snaps them out of that emotion and brings them down to a place where they're actually capable physically of ingesting information and processing it correctly. Now, sometimes you'll be assessing the situation at the exact same time. That's where the rack method can help. it can help you define the situation as you're bringing things down. Right? But today, we have a guest here that will take us through another technique that we can use to diffuse situations. I encourage you guys to try these methods where they're appropriate and see how it works for you. I've got a very exciting guest on here today, Doug Noll, one of the best lawyers in America in 2005, rated by U.S. News and World Report, and author of De-Escalation, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less, and co-founder of the Prison of Peace Project. Doug, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. Doug, do you want to take a minute to introduce yourself to the audience? To cover some of the things that you've got an amazing resume. I don't have time to go through everything. But do you want to tee yourself up a little bit?
Yeah, I'll give you the 30-second Reader's Digest version. I was born in Southern California, into affluence, and then went back east to college, Dartmouth College. I should say that I was born with a lot of problems. I was born almost blind, almost deaf, 2 club feet, bad teeth, and left-handed. So physically I was a mess and couldn't walk until I was about 3.5 years old. But I did get in the right line for brains. So I got to be pretty smart. And that's how I ended up going to Dartmouth College after high school. Came back to California, went to law school, graduated with honors, and decided to move to Central California because I wanted to live near the mountains. And for the next 22 years, I had a very successful career as a business and complex financial trial lawyer. I tried over 200 cases over that time period. To keep the story short, I made a decision in the mid-90s to learn to be a peacemaker. So I went back to school and got my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies, and left a very successful law practice and about $10 million on the table in 2000 to open up my mediation practice and peacemaking practice. And that's what I did very successfully. During that time period, I developed a really unique and radical set of de-escalation skills that we'll talk about in a minute. But what really was one of my more life-changing experiences was in 2010, when a colleague of mine, Laurel Carfer, and I began the Prison of Peace Project here in California. So we were invited in to train lifers in the largest, most violent women's prison in the world. And we accepted the challenge and started teaching our first 15 women in April of 2010. We had no idea what would happen. But by halfway through the course, the first 12-week curriculum, we had over 300 women in the prison. About 10% of the women, 3,000 women in the prison, 300 of them had signed up and said, I want to take this course. So we knew we had something that was greatly desirable. And we had also seen the amazing transformations that our first 15 women had gone through as we trained them. And one of the things one of the key parts of our training is to teaching them how to de-escalate using these skills that I had developed since 2004. Well, today, Prison of Peace has grown. We're in 15 California prisons, 14 prisons in Greece, a prison in Connecticut, and we've got startups in Nairobi and Italy. So it's spread around the world. We have colleagues all over the world who are teaching our curriculum, and we are funded by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, who give us grants so that we can go into prisons, and our population are long-term prison lifers, many of them murderers. For 2 years, I worked in Corcoran State Prison, which is one of the secured housing units in California, along with Pelican Bay, and I was working with guys coming out of gangs, and these were the darkest, most violent. And you can exactly. So that's kind of my background.
Okay. So I guess for our purposes here, we're looking to provide men with some tactical support, so to speak, tools that they can use in life, either at work or at home with their family, with colleagues, friends, and you talked about de-escalation. Now, is there a big difference in your approach between de-escalation from from like a coworker or a family member or or a stranger, or is it all the same process?
It's all the same.
Okay. Now the
human brain is the human brain, and they all react to this process the same way.
Okay. Now, before we were on the air, right, you and I talked about sort of the root of our the root of this mission here. And we touched on a couple of really interesting things. So we talked about toxic masculinity and the root cause of that. And I would love for you to give my audience your perspective. So toxic masculinity
Sure.
out there in the world, what is it to you? What are you experiencing, especially as you go through the Prison of Peace project? Are you seeing a difference between the prison world and the real, the world, the outside world, or is it all stemming from one thing?
I think it's all stemming from one thing.
Okay.
What that is a lack of emotional competency. And what I have witnessed and learned from my academic studies is that men and women in childhood are deeply abused by their parents who don't know any better. In fact, the research shows that 96% of all families are emotionally dysfunctional. And there is no way you can come out of an emotionally dysfunctional family emotionally healthy. So all of these behaviors and attitudes about machoism and sexual conquest and all that stuff, it's all toxic, and it's all based on lack of emotional competency caused by early childhood abuse that most parents don't even know that they are inflicting. And so what kind of abuse is this? Well, it's what I call emotional invalidation. So let's say you're 2 years old, and we all have been through this experience. You're 2 years old, you're 2.5, you're outside, you're running around, you fall down, you scrape your knee, you start to cry. 2 years old. What are you told? Stop crying. Don't be a sissy. Be a man. Don't be a girly girl. Tough it up. Suck it up, buttercup. And you hear these phrases all through your life, all through childhood. And what are those statements telling you? They're telling you not to be emotional. They're telling you that emotions are bad. They're telling you that to be a man, you can't feel anything. And it is the sum total of all of that experience that leads us males into behaviors that are extremely toxic and damaging to relationships. Women have the same problem, but their problems are different than men. It's just is not gender neutral. I mean, it's gender neutral. Men and women all suffer from this. It just manifests in different ways.
So
and part of the reason for this. Oh, go ahead.
So so I've got young children of my own, and we just had that situation happen. Little one's running on the concrete, eats it, gets up crying. And I know he's more startled. I'm assessing the situation. He seems more startled than actually hurt. So if I said, "Hey," I'm like, "Hey, buddy, it's okay. It doesn't hurt." Stand him up, and he stops crying though.
It does hurt.
But
it
not
does
as,
hurt.
But not
and
as
he
much
was
as
startled.
but not as much as he thinks.
It
So
doesn't matter.
how do we bridge that gap then?
You say, "Oh, buddy, man, that really scared you. That hurts a little. It stings." And you're kind of sad, and you're a little embarrassed that you fell over, and you feel kind of stupid, and you're a little scared and frightened, and you don't know if you're okay or not. That's what you say.
Okay.
You just reflect back his emotional experience. It doesn't matter whether you think it's valid or not. It's what he is experiencing in the moment.
Okay.
And you watch what happens when you do that. He will light up like a Christmas tree. Say, "Yeah, exactly right. Thank you, Daddy."
Okay. I'm going to try.
You will get more
it.
gratitude out of him
real.
in that moment. You will get more gratitude out of him in that moment than you will ever have gotten from him before in your life. And I tell people who have small children, 2 and 3 year olds, maybe 4-year-olds who are having tantrums, you do, and I'll explain how you do this in just a moment. But if you do this to your young children, every parent that I've taught this to says that within 4 to 6 months, tantrums have completely gone away and they've never seen a tantrum again.
Deal.
Because their kids have become the kids have started to learn how to be emotionally competent, and they can start to self-regulate themselves, even at 3 and 4 years old.
Okay.
But as long as you abuse your children by invalidating their emotions, they are not going to learn how to self-regulate and how to be self-aware, and they will just continue to revert back to that defensive mechanism that the brain has for protecting itself against the injury of emotional abuse.
Okay.
Which is to have a tantrum or shut down or become defensive.
Now, I guess in the conversation we were having before, I've mentioned to the audience before that I guess the way I wanted to articulate it was we were able to kind of divorce ourselves from our emotions in crisis situations or when things are getting crazy. And you mentioned deregulate a couple of times. Are we talking about the same
Correct.
thing, or
Yes.
is there a different technique to it?
Nope. Same thing.
Okay.
So let me just talk about that for a second. So
absolutely.
This is a basic de-escalation strategy. It's called affect labeling. I discovered it in 2004 in a really tough mediation, and Matthew Lieberman, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA, came out with a brain scanning study in 2007 where he studied affect labeling, and we now know exactly why affect labeling works in the brain. This is neuroscientifically based on science. It's not on psychology that I have a very low regard for, because most psychology is not based on good science. So just know that's my bias. If it's neuroscience, I'm all over it. If it's just mythological psychology based on Freud, you're not going to get me very far.
Okay.
So here's the technique. It's really simple. Everybody take out a pencil and paper, write this down. 3 steps. Step number 1, whenever you are with a highly emotional person, whether it's a 2-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 90-year-old, doesn't matter. The first thing you're going to do is ignore the words. When anybody's ever emotional, you don't need to listen to the words in that moment. You've got to forego all the training that you've learned about the words are important. They are not important. Ignore them.
Okay.
Because when you ignore the words, 2 things happen. 1, you're not going to get triggered, especially if somebody's yelling at you. And that's important. Protect yourself from getting triggered. And 2, you need to free up bandwidth to do the next 2 steps. Step number 2, you're going to read the emotional data fields of the upset person. And you're going to say, read the emotional data fields. What is that? Well, emotions are data. It's information. And it's fleeting and it's fast. But it also turns out that our human brains have evolved an innate ability to read the emotions of other human beings with extreme accuracy. And I can get into the evolutionary biology of why that happens. But suffice it to say, our brains are extremely capable of reading other people's emotions, their emotional data fields, and understanding what those emotions are very fast, and it's almost effortless. So the way you do that is just somebody's yelling at you, you just sit there in silence. So you're ignoring the words, and you're just waiting for your brain to process the information, and into your consciousness will come the emotions that the other person is experiencing. It happens automatically and effortlessly. I use it when I'm teaching in a workshop. I use a test that called the reading emotions and expressions by a neuroscientist in London. It's a brilliant test, and my students are amazed that out of 37 different facial expressions, they get 37 emotions absolutely correct. We just have this incredible power. So now we're going to put that power to use. So now you've got the emotion in your head. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to ask. Like I've used. I don't think I knew what I was doing, but in very tense emotional situations at work or with family, sometimes you gotta let the person who's agitated just get it all out. And
nope,
I've used
wrong.
So
I have to correct that.
No, it's perfect.
That's a myth.
But the reason I've let them do it is kind of deflates them. And that's the training I've gotten before, is that they, like you ignore the words, and that's kind of what I heard. You ignore the words, whatever they're yelling at you, you let them get it all out, and then you ask them to repeat themselves.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because this is one of these psychological myths that's just absolutely not true. It's based on a concept of catharsis, which is a Freudian concept that Freud developed back in the early 20th century. And, Freud was a genius, but there's nothing that he postulated that has been proven true by science. His database were 14 or 15 upper middle class Vietnamese women. That was his data set. And he was speculating on everything about theory of mind, and nothing that he wrote about, nothing that he talked about, nothing that he theorized has been proven by modern science to be accurate. It's all wrong. And the modern science shows that when you let somebody vent, all they do is reinforce their anger.
Okay.
So you don't want to let them vent. You don't want to let them blow it out. They will not. All they'll do is get themselves even angrier. But you can do this. Step number 3. So we've ignored the words. We're reading the emotional data fields. And the third step is we're going to reflect back the emotions that we have picked up by reading the emotional data fields with a simple you statement. So I'd say something like, Glenn, you are really pissed off, man. You feel disrespected. You don't feel heard. You don't feel appreciated. You don't feel supported. You're kind of anxious and scared. And you're a little sad because you feel a little betrayed. It's really pissing you off. And when you get it right, which you always will, by the way, you cannot make a mistake at this. That's another cool thing about this. You cannot be in error. It's impossible because of the way the brains are hardwired. What will happen is you, Glenn, will say, yeah, right. That's exactly how I feel. And then you just keep on with the process. And all you do is reflect back your emotional experience, the speaker's emotional experience with what you're picking up. And you just keep, the whole thing takes about 35 to 45 seconds, 90 seconds at the most, hence the title of my book.
Okay.
And because of the way our brains are hardwired, what's going on at a neurophysiological level is that we are inhibiting the emotional centers of the brain while we are activating the prefrontal cortex, the lateral prefrontal cortex. And that's what the brain scanning studies show, that when you affect label, you are actually turning on, the prefrontal cortex is turned off. When it's always turned off when we're emotional, which is why, when you're in a highly stressful emotional situation, it's impossible for us to suppress our emotions. We have to deal with our emotions differently in order to bring the prefrontal cortex back online. And at the same time, the emotional centers of the brain, the emotional circuits, are inhibited. And that's how it works. And it works every time because it's how we are hardwired. And that's why you can do it in 35 to 45 to 60 seconds, sometimes 90 seconds. This is a process that we acid tested in maximum security prisons. And we taught inmates, murderers, how to de-escalate violence in prison using this very simple technique. And it worked like a charm.
Now,
we've never had a report of it not working.
Now, how would you pivot that to? So, in my situation, I'm a people manager during the day, and I mean, 10 situations happen all the time. So we go immediately from, I want to say, reflecting back those emotions almost feels like agreement, right? I'm validating your emotions. So I agree. I agree with
Go
ahead.
Okay, go ahead. You are correct. You're valid, and you want to do that.
So I want to validate their emotions, but not necessarily the behavior or the reason that they're in my office and I have to talk to them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So the mantra is de-escalate first, then problem solve.
Okay.
Until you get people calmed down, you can't even begin to address the problem that caused the emotional reaction or explosion in the first place, whether you're dealing with a 2-year-old or, like I said, a 40-year-old. And what I tell parents is don't ever attempt to discipline a child, especially a small child, until you've got them calmed down. Because when they're emotional, they're not in any position to learn anything. And the whole point of discipline, hopefully, is not for vengeance. It's to teach the child something. But your child will not be able to learn until the emotions have passed and have calmed down. And then you can have a calm conversation and talk about consequences and impose whatever discipline is appropriate. But if you've got a crying kid or a kid who's done something that requires some discipline and you start disciplining while that child is upset, you're wasting your time and you're abusing the child.
Yeah, and they're not absorbing any of the information anyway.
Nothing. So in your situation, you've got a situation at work where somebody's emotional, and your job, first of all, is to calm them down.
It's
and
true.
You do that by affect labeling. Just calm them down. 99% of the time, the problem will resolve itself once you got people calmed down. But every now and then, you need to go beyond. Once you got them calmed down, then you've got to, maybe there are consequences that have to be discussed, or there's a problem that has to be solved. But you can't even get there until you get people calmed down first. And the problem that we have is that people jump into problem solving way, way too early. And they do that to soothe their own anxiety around the emotional experience that somebody else is having.
Okay.
So if somebody gets tense at work or gets upset or starts to cry or starts to yell, if you're not trained properly, then what happens, and this is natural for every human being, you will naturally become anxious. And then your unconscious reaction is to try to stop that emotion as quickly as you can to make yourself feel better.
And as a coach,
And
we have to
and that's
stay
the worst
neutral.
thing. Yeah, and that's the worst thing you can do. Absolutely the worst thing you can do. All you do is make it worse.
Okay.
So what you want to do is de-escalate by labeling their emotions until you get nod of the head, a verbal response exactly, a dropping of the shoulder, and a sigh of relief. The 4 involuntary relaxation responses to de-escalation. When those things happen, now you can pivot to problem solving if that becomes necessary.
Okay. And I've used something like that in a couple of coachings.
Good.
In that you ask them a question they're not ready for, and then now you've kind of piqued their interest. Now again, those involuntary signs showing that hey, I'm receptive.
There are a couple of things here that I've learned that I think are really important. One, when you're doing this de-escalation technique, you never ask a question. You never say, "Are you angry?" You never ask, "Are you angry?" And the other thing you never do is you never use an I statement. It seems to me that you're really angry. Or, I think you're really angry. Or it seems to me. Or I feel your anger. Never use an I statement when you're de-escalating.
Okay.
Only use a you statement. That whole I statement stuff came from a misinterpretation of a 1960s psychologist, Roger Gordon, who invented the term active listening. People for the last 80 years have completely misconstrued his teaching, and they got it all screwed up. And they're still, I can't believe that people are still teaching it today, but they are. Even at the graduate school where I work, I have colleagues that teach I statements and active listening and de-escalation. I just shake my head. They should know better.
So one of the things that you mentioned that in some of your work was you mentioned earlier today even emotional validation, but you mentioned that it's deadly. Now, I've talked about some of the dangers of emasculation. Are those two the same thing? And if
they can be,
and how's it deadly?
They can be, but they're also different. I would say emotional invalidation is broader. So there's a study that I think every intelligent person on the planet should read, at least read the summary, called, excuse me,
bless you,
the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study out of San Diego, California. It's a long-term study. It's still going on, being conducted by the Kaiser Foundation. Kaiser's model is to keep people out of hospitals. Their whole thing is wellness. And, if they can keep people out of hospitals, then they make more money and all is good. Very different than the traditional allopathic philosophy. So they got interested in studying the relationship between childhood abuse and later life outcomes. And so they had a database of about 30,000 patients who had all these horrible things like cancer and diabetes and chronic pulmonary obstructive disorder and alcoholism and addiction, all the bad things that happen to people in life. And they sent out very detailed questionnaires about early childhood experiences. And what they learned was that if you have 3 adverse childhood experiences, you're 1,000 times more likely to be drug addicted or alcohol addicted or be divorced or go to prison or die of cancer, die of heart disease, die of CPOD, die of diabetes at a relatively young age. So that gets to the question, what is an adverse childhood experience? Well, they have 9 basic categories. 2 of them are physical, which would be obvious. Physical abuse, being beaten, and the other one's sexual abuse, which of course is horrible.
Of course.
But the other 7 are all emotional abuse, including emotional invalidation. Every time you emotionally invalidate your child, you're chipping away at that health. It accumulates to an ace. And if you really invalidate your children a lot because you can't handle the child's emotions, you can guarantee that child's going to grow up damaged and probably going to suffer later in life from a serious disease. Almost guaranteed.
So that's
how serious this is.
Now is I'm not trying to make this seem smaller, but is when we make mistakes like this with coworkers or family friends or people who are adults, have we matured to a point where we're more shielded from that?
No, there's a study out of Sweden that shows that when there are these kinds of things happen, and if it's just occasional, obviously it's not going to be a lot of damage. But if this is sort of a chronic situation, For example, you've got a couple that's chronically fighting, or you've got a toxic workplace where there's just a lot of anger and aggressiveness and real emotional problems. What the Swedish study shows is that these people are 5 times more likely to die of early death than people who aren't in conflict. And it basically is a study that follows on the ACEs study, and it shows that adults suffer from the same thing. It's not everybody's going to suffer from this. Of course, there's resilience, and people can recover. But the mere fact that this kind of emotional abuse leads to medical illness, serious medical illness, ought to be a wake-up call for people to understand that there are health consequences, physical health consequences, to doing something that seems as benign as putting down a child's emotions or putting down a coworker's. You're being a drama queen. Get over it. That kind of statement is extremely damaging. I cannot emphasize that enough. And it's something once you learn not to do it, you don't do it. But for people who have not been trained, you do it all the time without thinking, because all you're doing is soothing your own emotion. It's really quite selfish. The only reason you put somebody else's emotions down is because you are anxious yourself and you are trying to calm yourself down. And you do it in the most destructive way possible, which is by invalidating the other person.
Wow.
And the science is irrefutable on this.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
It's huge.
I'm
huge.
I'm absorbing this. So
it's huge.
So Doug, one last question before we let you get going. I mentioned in some of the conversations we've had about how some people in business get soft skills wrong.
Yes.
Let's end on this note. How do people get soft skills wrong, and is there a way to fix it?
Well, let's start off with where the term soft skills came from.
What I was taught were that soft skills were the things that can't necessarily be taught, academically.
Yep. More mythology. Totally wrong. Soft skills is a term that was coined by the United States Army Command System in the 1960s to describe the skills that are required to win in the battle space. These are the essential skills that commanders must have in order to win a battle. And they're called soft skills to contrast them from driving a tank or marching through the mud, firing a rifle, or driving a heavy truck. Those were called hard skills. Hard skills were really easy to teach. You take an 18-year-old, and in a year you can teach an 18-year-old to be a soldier. Hard skills. Soft skills are the skills that commanders need in order to guide, motivate, and control an army. They're the most important skills in the military. And business people took the term soft, not understanding the context in which the term was coined by the U.S. Army, and made it into a pejorative. Soft skills are these touchy-feely, woo-woo, emotional crap that can't be taught and isn't academic, and all wrong. Really wrong. Soft skills, if you want to be accurate about it, if you want to be an effective CEO or an effective leader, forget the technical skills. You can teach a monkey the technical skills that you've learned. You really can. What the harder skills to master are the skills around emotions and how to lead people. And the Army calls them soft skills, but I would actually call them diamond skills, because those are the skills that are going to advance your career, that are going to make you a successful and powerful leader that anybody wants to follow. And if you don't take the time to master those skills, you're not going to be a leader. You're just simply not going to be a leader. You can't lead without having a mastery of these skills. And the Army recognizes it, as it does the other armed forces. But the business world doesn't get it. And the reason I think that the business world doesn't get it is because people are emotionally incompetent. They grow up emotionally abused. They're afraid of emotions. They're shut down. And they really don't want to go to the messiness and pain that they experienced as children to sort through what it means to be emotionally competent. And so this myth persists to the detriment of everybody. And the people that get it are enormously successful. And the people that don't get it, they might have some success, sure. But there are going to be a lot of people that don't have success.
Awesome.
I can't overstate how important that is.
Well, Doug, thank you very much for coming on to the show today. how can people best find your work, or what do you recommend that they do if they want more information on this very fascinating subject?
It's really simple. Go to my website, dougnoll.com, DOUGNOLL.com. I have a ton of resources there. You can buy my books. You can take my online courses, all that stuff. You can contact me at doug@dougnoll.com. I'm a solopreneur. I don't have an entourage. I answer all my own emails. I'm a staff of one. And so feel free to email me there. And I also invite people to go to my YouTube channel, douglasnoll.com, or Douglas Noll. You can just YouTube me or Google me. And I've got about 60 or 70 videos on all these different topics that if you want to learn more about this stuff and what we've been talking about today, like I said, I've got almost 100 YouTube videos up discussing these topics in various contexts that could be very useful to people.
Awesome. Doug, thank you very much for your time today. Everybody, De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. Go get yourself a copy today. Doug, thank you very much for your time.
Hey, Glenn, thank you.
Now, I suggest that everyone try some of these techniques when the opportunities come forward. Just remember, you're already doing some of the things that Doug has suggested now. When some of my kids hit the ground, sometimes you can tell that it truly is painful. Watch someone stub their toe. We've all lived through that. And there's nothing that daddy can do about that. That's just something that has to be endured. What do you say? That sucks, buddy. You know, that must really hurt. And you're already validating their emotions like Doug was talking about. And it can prove, and it does prove, to calm things down considerably. I've tried this. I've been doing some of those minor things. I've tried since the interview to actually do some of these things. And they've worked, with as much success as I've had in executing them. But the first question I had for Doug after this interview was, how do we continue to build emotional fortitude in our children? I know that's why most parents tell their kids to man up. Right? They do it because we don't want our kids to require coddling, right? And Doug's response was that in his findings, children who learn to competently process their emotions through this process, they become unafraid of those emotions and they can start to process them at a higher efficiency. So I would say try everything as you will, folks. Remember, de-escalate before you problem solve or teach. That's advice you can take to the bank. That's our show, folks. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you liked this program, please leave us a 5-star review on every platform that you can. We're on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, and wherever else you get your content. Your review can help us get the word out. Good luck out there.